What's up guys, welcome back to the channel. Today we are installing an electric power steering conversion in my 2004 Lexus IS300 and we're gonna do the entire swap for under 500 bucks. Let's go. Now if you've got a 2J or 1J or whatever in your car, it doesn't have to be either one of these things, and you've got a hydraulic power steering pump on it that works great, then maybe this video is not for you. But if your hydraulic pump leaks or whines or just doesn't look good in your engine bay and you wanna clean things up, then you are on track and I think this video will help you out. Now first and foremost, we can't do an electric steering conversion without an electric steering motor. That's where this comes into play. This is from a 2005 Saturn Vue. I can't remember the exact year range. I think it's like 05, 06, 05 07 maybe, but I'll confirm it both on the screen somewhere here and also in the description below. But this comes out of a Saturn Vue or a Chevy Equinox, and you do not need the entire assembly with the steering wheel and the stalk and the key and all that, but for me it was faster. And I think on the day that I bought this, it was a sale, so I was able to just get all of it for like $65. Now normally the motors themselves go for about 65, 70 bucks. That's typically the most I've ever paid for one. And you can get this entire assembly with it, which I highly recommend because you need things like these spline adapters and this tube right here that covers up the internal spline from the steering wheel. And we'll get into all these details a little deeper here in a moment, but that is the gist of it. You need the column from a Chevy Equinox or a Saturn Vue. They're relatively easy to pull. I think I can get them out in like 15 minutes max. And it's a pretty painless process. So this is the main component. You're gonna need one of these. Next, we're going to need some connectors so that we can apply our power and ground leads, and then we're going to need a controller so that we can actually run the unit. Now you can get these from Epowersteering.com, or you can get them from a European, I believe, seller on eBay, and they're a little bit less money. I'll put the link to both below. I really like the Epowersteering guys. They've been very helpful to me, so I try to support them when I can. But these controllers do work really well, and this specific controller is automatic, meaning you cannot change the amount of steering assist that you get from this motor based on anything with a manual control, and I'll get into all the details of how it assists later, but there are two different options when you buy these. One of them has a knob and one of them does not, and you can just pick that at your own discretion. Next, we have this connector here. I actually got two of them just in case. This is from Epowersteering, and it's just a single connector with the pins and then a retaining clip. Basically, it's just this plug right here without cut wires. It's really nice to just run power straight in and ground straight out, rather than having to try to crimp onto an existing plug. This goes to the ECU on our steering motor here. You can see that big connector there. And then you can see this was the original that went here, and that's gonna be removed in favor of this controller box here. That'll go there. And then we have a couple wires that we'll need to connect. And that's pretty much it. It's very simple. These do not have any sort of CAN bus connection to your factory ECU or anything like that, and that's why it's a great option for a lot of older cars. You don't have to do any crazy conversion. You just wire it up and it works. Next on our list is going to be wire. Now this is 8-gauge wire. You don't have to buy two colors. I just like to color code them, so obviously reference wise you can look at it and know what it's for. And I got a ton of it because I had some for some other projects, so make sure you buy enough depending on where you're trying to power this thing from your battery. We're going to come off the battery positive terminal, we're going to go into a breaker, and then we're going to come off that breaker and go to our motor over here via our new plug that we have. So we want to make sure that you got the 8-gauge, make sure you got enough, don't cheap out on this, buy copper free, just do it once and do it right, it's definitely worth it. Lastly, at least as far as the main components for this conversion go, you need a power steering delete. If you currently have a hydraulic pump on your car, it needs to come off. We cannot run both of these in conjunction with each other. You cannot have a hydraulic pump here and an electric motor inside. It's not gonna work. Please don't try it. So you need to get rid of that factory pump. And if you have a JZ, you can use the pulley that I use, which is from a company called Heat Lightning. Now this is a really cool option because it sits in the same exact location as the factory pump, and it uses the same belt, and everything is the exact same. You tension it the same, install it the same, nothing is different, and it works perfect. It doesn't squeal, it doesn't make any noise. It's just as if the pump is there the entire time. Never mind, I lied. That delete pulley is not the last thing you'll need. One more thing you're gonna have to do is loop the power steering fluid at the factory steering rack. Now we're on the lift, it's a lot easier to see. So there's two fittings that you can get from Drift Motion. This one or this one, I can't remember which one's which, but I think this one's an M17 by 1.5 to -6AN male flare fitting. And then this one is an M16 by 1.5 to -6. Then I just took two vibrant 90-degree fittings, put some hose in there, had to play with it a little bit to figure out the length. They're crank tight and it has no issues. Now before I put this on, of course I turned the rack left and right and pumped out all the fluid. This rack was brand new, as you can see it's pretty clean, and there's still a little bit that they get sent with, so I pumped all that out and then I put these on, and that way when you're turning left and right there's no pressure inside building up inside this hose because we don't need it anymore. Now if you buy a power steering kit from Epowersteering.com, they're gonna tell you that you should take the seal out of the inside of the rack. I did not do this, but there's a seal somewhere inside here that if you take it out, it'll stop the rack from building any pressure whatsoever in between. Now I imagine it's probably somewhere in here between these two fittings. I don't really know. I've never had a problem with it, but I just want to put that in there as a disclaimer. If you take the seal out, it should last longer and you should get less resistance when you're steering. I don't feel anything, so I'm gonna run it how it is probably, but just know that if you do that, you might be better off. And in final words of preparation for you guys, the inside is where all this magic is really gonna happen, so you wanna make sure that you've got space. You wanna make sure the car's relatively clean. I have to drive through grass and park in grass, so my floor mat is always pretty disgusting. But we're gonna pull this lower panel out, we're gonna pull the gauge cluster trim panel out, and then we're gonna get all the tools we need, sockets, stuff like that, Phillips head screwdrivers to pull panels, and drop the column down, and I can show you how this electric motor is gonna go up in place here. Now as we get started on this, I need to mention that you will need a welder. It doesn't have to be a TIG welder, it can be a MIG welder, but you need a welder. So if you don't have a welder and some angle grinders and some ways to cut and fit and stuff like that, this project is going to be a bit difficult for you to do, and I highly recommend not doing it yourself. And with that, I must also add a disclaimer that I'm not responsible for anyone who is driving around and their steering wheel comes off in their hands while the rest of the car is still moving or anything like that. So if you are incompetent or you have a failure or anything happens, I am not liable for this, and I mean that in the nicest way possible. Thanks for watching. Back to the show. Now getting started, I'm gonna go ahead and just dismantle this entire column and get all the crap out of the way that I know we're not gonna use. Things like this boot down here, all this stuff up here. We're gonna get this out of the way, then we're gonna cut a big section of this off. There's no reason to have it in our way, so it's gotta go. Let's get to it. Okay, we got this thing a little more dismantled so we can see things better. This flange right here is very important. This motor is obviously important. All this is important. This right here, not so important. These two mounts are Saturn view mounts. We're not gonna use them because obviously we're adapting this to the IS300. So these are gonna go, but we wanna have them for a reference point so we don't basically run out of material. I've never done this in an IS, so you guys are learning with me as far as what we have available to work with. The best way to get this thing apart then without overcutting or taking away material that we can't get back is to loosen this housing right here and pull it off of this, because right now the steering wheel attaches to a shaft and that shaft slides over the internal shaft that's inside this motor. The way this thing works is it takes steering input from the driver and then it outputs power through the shaft to the steering rack itself. Now to do so, take these bolts out here. I already loosened them. They're 10mm headed M6s. We're gonna pull these out and pull this flange off, and you'll be able to see a little bit more of how this setup works. So we're gonna pull out on this and it should just kind of come out, and there we go. So now that we have the shaft of the motor out and exposed, you can kind of see more of how it works. And inside here, although you can't see it right now, the steering wheel attaches to a shaft, which then comes down here and at some point converts to a female, which then slides over this male portion of the motor here. Now we need to figure out how much of this we need so that we can cut it off. Now if you're doing this in a junkyard, I recommend just taking your Sawzall and cutting like as high up as you possibly can. We should land somewhere in the middle here, but just to be safe, we can never add that material back, so you might as well get as much as possible when you're pulling this at the yard. Before I cut this one specifically, I'm gonna pull the column out of the car, and that way we have a better reference point. Once you get into the car, we're just gonna pull off anything that would be in the way of removing the column. So things like this lower panel here, this trim piece here, the trim that goes around here that I've already taken off, anything like that, just go ahead and remove it now. Now that the lower panel's out of the way, the upper panel's out of the way, and the cluster's out of the way, we can move on to pulling this panel right here. This little piece of sheet metal is blocking the column from coming down, and there's 3 10mm headed bolts that hold it in. One right here, and one up here, and one down here. Now if you see all this extra wiring, it's because this thing has an engine bay tuck, and I didn't finish this because I knew I was gonna have to get in here and do all this. So this won't always be hanging like that, but in case you're wondering why you don't have the wires, that's the reason. So don't worry about those. Go ahead and pull this plate out of your way. Once the steel panel's out of the way, you can see the remaining hardware. We've got 2 studs up here, 2 studs further back, and then a single bolt at the bottom. These are 14mm heads. We're gonna pull both of those off. Back here, you can see, let me show you with the extension. There's a black stud. I've already loosened mine. You can see the nut right there. There's a spring in the way. It does have a specific orientation. Pay attention to that in case we're able to reuse it, we will. And then lastly, at the bottom, you can see there's a 12mm bolt that goes through here. And this is the steering shaft spline that goes into this DD that then goes through the firewall. We're gonna leave this in place. We're gonna pull this bolt out. And that way, when we pull on the steering assembly, we can pull the shaft out and this thing will just sit here and stay in its position. Now, before you loosen all this stuff, be mindful of all your wiring. You wanna make sure that we loosen some of this so it's not all in the way. You won't have as much wiring as me, but some of these electrical taped harnesses that go to the ignition and stuff like that, all that's going to be in your car too. And then everything that attaches to the key assembly, you need to also disconnect, because you can see it comes off the side of the column here. So when you go to pull it out, if you don't unplug this, it's going to get stuck in the car. It's kind of heavy. You're not going to expect it, so make sure you unplug it first so that you don't tear up any of your wiring in the process. Right now I'm unplugging everything from the bottom of the column. You had a big black plug here, a smaller black one here. You have your impact for the airbag here. That's all the yellow stuff denotes impact. And then one more black plug here. Down here, you'll see there's a little clip that kind of holds this harness into the column itself. You're gonna wanna push on it from this side and that side, and then it will just pop through. Once all that's unplugged, there's one more black clip right here going into this lower plate on the bottom of the column. Just push that in with a flathead and pop that one down, then your harness will drop down somewhat out of the way. Then there's 4 more connectors on the bottom of the ignition assembly here. So make sure you get those 4 disconnected, and then we should be ready to pull everything out. You can see I've got it loose. So the next step is to just start removing them, and then I'm gonna, at the same time, wiggle it so I can get the splines off that shaft down there at the firewall. And there we have it. Factory column's out. I got the electric motor in place sitting in the car, and it looks huge, but just remember this has been done before. It wasn't documented, so we can't look at it for a how-to, which is why I'm filming this, but just know that it has been done, so we're going down a road that does have an end. Now, first thing we gotta do is pull this adapter off here. We're probably gonna end up using this, and the main reason for that is the spline count. There's a very high likelihood that the Toyota spline count is different than this, so we wanna use this piece here as an adapter to get to, or from, in this case, the electric steering motor. So what we're probably gonna do is cut off this shaft right here, and then weld it to something that then goes to that adapter over there on the firewall, or maybe weld to that piece. I don't know, we'll see how it goes. We may not be able to use that one and this one just because we don't have a ton of space there relative to where the motor has to live, but that's what we're gonna figure out right now. So first, let's pull this off. I pulled the bolt out. It's a 13 mil headed bolt. It looks like the best and really only option for how to mount this is essentially gonna be like this, and we're gonna bottom it all the way out. So the back of the motor, or this port right here, is going to go all the way against these studs. Now I don't know if those studs need to be cut out. I'm not really down for that. In case you ever want to go back, you wouldn't be able to, but I don't think they're gonna have to be cut. Everything else, when it's in this position, looks pretty good. The motor's as high as it can be, giving us enough room for all of our Toyota components to exist over here. It also allows us to run the lower plastic cover right here. It looks like it could be a little close, but maybe when it's actually in place, it'll be better, it'll clear. I don't know exactly how it's gonna sit yet, but this gives us plenty of room for the motor on this side, the ECU here. It's a little bit of a slow process here, but let's go take apart that column and just get an idea of kind of how we're looking. I've got both columns lined up here, IS300 on this side, Saturn view on this side. We're just gonna dismantle both of them. One cool thing is we're not gonna lose the tilt because it's so far up on the column. Any adaptation we do is gonna happen after our key assembly, of course, and after our mount here. So it's probably gonna get cut off somewhere in this area, and then whatever length this has to be will be welded on here. And of course the interior shaft will be modded as well. Looking at the Lexus column, I didn't even pay attention to the fact that this portion here unbolts. It's a 12 millimeter, so I'm gonna take it off and get it out of the way. And we'll probably never use it, but at least we'll have it. And now our airbag is out. Now we're ready to pull the nut off the top so we can loosen the wheel and take it off the shaft. Now there is a clock spring assembly behind here, and those of you who've dealt with one know what I'm talking about, but if you haven't, basically it's just what allows all of these wires in here to exist and still make contact with what's on the other side while the wheel spins, so things like cruise and shift and all that stuff works. I'm gonna grab a puller and we're gonna press this off and pull the wheel this direction. There we go, pretty easy. Now our wheel is free. I'm gonna wobble it off and make sure we don't damage any of this stuff right here. This connector needs to come unplugged so that the clock spring still works next time we put it back together. So fish that through. Don't rush it, even though I want to. I'm gonna loop it out. There we are. Okay, shaft is out, wheel is separate. Cool story. Now that the Lexus shaft is pretty much ready to disassemble, we're gonna first take apart the rest of the Saturn assembly. Now I'm not gonna pull the wheel off and the airbag because it takes time and we don't care about this stuff. So we're just going to cut this thing apart. All right, we got the outer section off. This is the lower piece that we're gonna salvage, and it may be somewhere in here. We don't know yet. Got our plastic cleaned up. Now we can cut the shaft the rest of the way off. I'm just gonna follow my original cut line, get this piece in my hands, and then we can move on to fitting it and sizing it and all that. All right, we are officially done with this piece of shit, so throw it in your nearest trash can as soon as humanly possible. Now with these pieces freed up, you can see how we're just gonna basically transfer this over to this area. This is the internal piece that I cut off in the last clip, and this is going to essentially get welded to this right here. Next on the list is taking this internal shaft out of this right here. So what we're gonna do is flip this guy up, and if you look right here, there's a small circlip inside here. It's pretty hard to see, and I'm gonna put it in my vise so that I can actually stabilize it to get it out. When I pull this clip out, this entire internal shaft will slide this direction. We're gonna pull the whole thing out. So this clip, I just use these right here, and when you push in, they go out. So I just went like that and pushed out, and it got the clip off, as you can see. And thankfully this does not fall out through the bottom. I think it could have, but obviously I'm not gonna push on it. And when I do this, just have a towel close by to cover it so that if it does fly off, it doesn't go somewhere in your shop that you'll never be able to find it again. Once you got the clip off, set it out of the way, and I think we're ready to pull the shaft out. You can see it will wiggle now, but something is kind of holding it, so let's take it out of the vise. We don't want to smack it yet. I have a dead blow ready, but I don't want to hit it for no reason and do some damage to it. It might just be pressed in here, but it might also have something to do with our steering lock or some other component, so let's get into it. All right, so with the tilt function on this thing, if you look right through here, you can see there's like an enlarged portion. This is a larger diameter than this right here, is a little transition. And there's an assembly in there that is getting caught when I try to slide it out. So it looks like I need to pull it off from the other side, which is a little bit more work. It's kind of annoying, but that's what we're gonna have to do. There's just a joint in there that flexes, kind of like a U-joint that allows the shaft to move up and down as the tilt's being used. And I should have caught that, but it's okay. We didn't hit it too hard yet, so let's unbolt this thing and see what it looks like as we take a little bit more apart. Eventually, we're just gonna be able to grab the shaft and pull it out this direction. Now we can pull our damn shaft out. So this is the center section that was getting caught on the interior of this housing, and had I hit it harder, I only would have done damage. It never would have come out. So I'm glad I chilled out when I did. This is the entire shaft. Now the whole reason for this, just to reiterate, is that we want to cut this down and we want to put this thing in place somewhere over here. I know this has felt like a lot up until this point, and it's a little more than I expected, but not too crazy. And the next step is going to feel good because we're going to make some progress that feels like we're actually getting something done rather than just taking apart multiple steering columns with no end in sight. Now that we have the housing here for the IS300 and we have this piece here, the next step is to go put it in the car and test fit everything and try to figure out where we're going to locate the motor. We're going to bolt this in place with the OEM 2 studs, and then we're going to mark this with a Sharpie where we want to cut it down. Now we're going to base that mark and that cut on where the motor can sit, because we know this flange bolts to the motor, and that's the start of the motor assembly. Okay, we've got the empty column housing in place now, and it gives us a better idea of the kind of space we're gonna have down here. And I will say it's not much. Now we already kind of knew that, but once you see it, it puts it into perspective. If I come forward from that studded area to the backside of where this key assembly stops, because we're not gonna move this, obviously, we have basically 5 inches. This is by far the hardest part because it's just tough to get in here, as you can obviously see. The cool part about this though is that once the housing is sorted and all this stuff is done, we just make the motor fit it, and then we make our interior shafts fit that, and those lengths will be dictated by this housing. So that part's relatively easy. This is the toughest portion of the project. Got it cut down, trimmed it a little bit too, just cleaned it up with a flat disc and then a deburring tool so I don't cut myself when I'm trying to install things. And now, because I know the length is not insane, we're gonna go ahead and cut this down too. With these both being cut now, I can finally show you the rough estimate of what it's gonna look like. Of course, they are the same diameter, so they're gonna have to be perfectly belt sanded down, which is no problem, but it is something that has to happen. And then it's just gonna be a butt weld, just like this. And this will go over the motor, you know, it's pretty much the whole deal. It's time for our first test fit. We're gonna leave this 3-bolt flange out. This is what it looks like installed, but obviously it's still too long. So for right now, we're just gonna take this section, slide it over this, and you can see again the diameters are the same, so it's not going to slide over this portion, but it's going to give us an idea of how long that 3-bolt flange piece needs to be. And we can also kind of take note of where the ignition cylinder sits relative to the ECU, the motor, all that stuff. All right, we're looking at my second test fit. The first one I did not film. I did not cut this housing down enough, and we are making contact with the rear studs. All right, unfortunately for this clip, I need to yell over the lawnmower. We're gonna knock this piece out right here. It's a little crossbar in the motor itself. I think getting rid of this is gonna allow me to shove this thing back just enough, and then we can still keep these tabs and the OEM studs. I'm hoping that's what we can do, and then we can mount something from here to the studs and make it really, really strong. So I'm gonna take a 10mm socket and just tap this guy out. Shaft came out pretty easily. Let's go toss her back in and see if it fits a little better. Well, even with that modification and this post out or crossbar or whatever, still doesn't quite fit. We need to cut this down a little bit more. All right, we're finally on to something. I trimmed it down fairly far. I don't want to go any farther than I already did, just put it that way. I'll show you in a second. But with the motor held up, I can get it nice and center. The shaft is center in the column. And looking on the inside, I can see it's pretty close to center. And if I push up like this, I'm able to get everything pretty much in place. It's hard to do it all, obviously, like I said, with the weight of it all, but right there, minus this wiring harness that I've got in the way, is about what we want. Now the only problem area I see is over here, trying to get these ignition plugs in, which right now won't even reach. I got to pull them around the motor once this is in place. So what I'm gonna do now is take my tape measure and measure from my flange to this at the longest distance. Then we'll add maybe a 1/16 or an 1/8 of an inch, and then that's what we'll cut down our flange portion to. Looks to be about an inch. With our 1 inch measurement in mind, I went ahead and cut this thing down. I got it all prepped to go, ready to be welded. We went to test fit it and it still did not work. I had to cut this down even more. You can see now our weld is gone. We went deeper than expected. And now it lines up inside, everything is good. We have really good placement with those 2 rear studs with respect to the motor, and we're good to go. So before we can mark this and then weld it, we have to get this surface flat, and obviously it's not that easy with the plate in the way. So I'm gonna cut this plate out of my way. We're gonna get this thing flat with either the belt sander or a flap disc or a combination of whatever it takes. And then we'll be ready to mark this, weld it, finish weld it, and when we do that, we can re-weld this seam right here. Getting this flat has been a bit of a struggle. You can see where I cut the rest of it out so I can get in there and prep all around, and it's not perfect in there, but it's pretty good. I wanna make sure I still have access to weld it with my TIG torch as well, which is gonna be tight, but it should be doable. And now we have our flange. So this is gonna go here, and that's pretty much exactly where it's gonna go, except we don't know what our rotation is gonna be. So we gotta clock this thing so that we position the motor in the proper spot. So let's go do that now. We'll mark it with a Sharpie. Tack it, check it, weld it, move on to the internal part of our shaft, and then we'll go back to the last portion, which is going to be using those rear studs to build a secondary mount so we're not just relying on these 2. For this test fit, I'm going to fully tighten this flange. We want to make sure that everything is in its final position so that nothing can move, and that way our welding process is on point and nothing is out of whack. All right, I got everything in place. I'm holding it up. Everything looks pretty good. Our flange is in alignment. My biggest concern was this wiring right here, and if I move it this direction at all, it's not going to change the accessibility here, but with it moved or rotated like so, I can actually get the connector in fine. Last thing to consider is our feet and where my feet are going to be relative to this motor. If I let off the clutch or go to clutch kick, am I going to kick this? And the answer right now is no, because the panel is here, which is pretty much the lowest point. It's maybe about even, but this is sagging right now, so we should be chilling there as well. And we won't know until I tack it, but I think I'm good to mark it, so I'm gonna do that off camera. I'll get it tacked and I'll show it to you once it's all one piece. We're all tacked up, everything's nice and center. Let's go see how it fits. We got our first installed looks. Everything looks pretty solid. We got nice motor clearance over here. We have good clearance with our vent over here. We have enough clearance over here for our connectors for the ignition. So overall, I'm very happy with it. The next thing that I wanted to tackle is the backside, or from the motor to our steering rack, because that's pretty easy to do and it has to get done. We're gonna go ahead and knock that side out. If you're curious about what this wire is, it's the power wire that I ran for this assembly a long time ago. That's why that's hanging in the way. We're gonna get this thing cleaned up so I can get my head down in here, and we'll look up and see what our shaft to shaft connection is gonna look like. I wanna show the pedals in this shot so you can kind of orient yourself with where we are. We are looking up, and I'm surprised at how easy this is to show you. We've got our shaft coming out of the electric motor here, and here is the steering rack side. So we need to adapt the two, so we're gonna take the piece that came with the Saturn view, we're gonna cut that a little bit long, and we're gonna do the same thing with the piece that goes in there, the factory IS300 piece, and we're gonna merge the 2 of those together. I got our 2 shafts here. This is the Saturn view, this is the IS300. We're gonna cut this one here, we're gonna cut this one right here. All right, we're back underneath the dash. Right here is the view piece installed. So basically we're gonna just take the piece off of this and make it an adapter to go from the spline to the shaft. It'll be welded there, and then on this side it will slide in. So it'll slide in here, and then it will slide on here. It will make it hard to install, but that's pretty much how all these are. Even with like a regular steering column, you have to drop the splines in before you can put it on your studs and bolt things in place. The same thing's gonna apply here. It's just gonna be a little harder since the assembly weighs a little bit more. I'll get that done and we'll see how we're looking. Looking at things again after they've been trimmed down. You can tell it's not straight right now, but I double checked because I wasn't actually sure. And there's a DD on the rack itself, and it comes straight through to this one right here. So this one actually will flex. It's made to move up and down. So I'm actually gonna make this adapter straight so that it comes straight out of this right here and goes straight into this. But I can't do that until I trim this thing down. So that's the plan, and then we'll be done. I got my final measurements. We're cutting the shaft down just a little bit, as you can see. Just trimmed my shaft down maybe another 1/8 to 1/4 of an inch. And then I marked this portion, and you can tell I cut a lot of it off. We're gonna clean these edges up. I just had to make it a little bit more low profile. And the plan is now to drill it out from this side so that this can slide inside of it, so that we can weld it around here, but with a nice little bit of depth in there so it's nice and strong. and weld all the way around, and she should be really stout. I went and test fit it in the car and marked my Sharpie line where I wanted it. All right, I hit a quick test fit. You can see we got the upper piece in, get the lower piece in, and we're good. We're good to go. Looks nice and straight. No binding, no issues. Of course, we haven't spun it yet, left or right, but we should be good there. So next, we can move up to our top shaft or our like main portion of this thing. So what we're gonna do now is basically take this thing off and figure out where the best spot is to cut this so that we can adapt our Saturn view piece to this right here. So let's pull this thing apart and see exactly where our spot's gonna be. And of course, the shaft that goes into the view motor is gonna be cut down quite a bit. All right, I got the factory column reassembled. I got this piece cleaned up with some brake clean just to get some of the oil and stuff out. This slides over this thing nicely, and it can go all the way down the shaft if we need it to. Of course, there's only splines up to here, so this section is gonna be what we use at the least, and we can use more if needed. There's a little clip on it right here, which makes it kind of hard to get on and off. But we're gonna have to cut this down, there's no question about it, just a matter of where. So in this assembly here, I wanted to put it all back together with the tilt mechanism and everything in place. No springs required, but we just need to set the depth of the actual shaft. So right here, you can see it can move, but it is bottomed out right there, and our little lip for our C-clippers right there. So this is the maximum length. This is exactly where it needs to sit. And of course, this is where the motor is. So we know we're gonna cut it here for certain, and we're definitely gonna end up cutting it further back. It's looking like the depth of this is shorter than the distance we have right here. So we're gonna have to figure that out. But I'm gonna measure some things, I'll mark some stuff down, and we will move forward. All right, I got 3 things that I care about. I wanna know the flange to the bottom of our lock mechanism here. I wanna know the flange to this weld right here, and I wanna know the flange to this transition right here. These are just reference points, but I'm gonna measure each one, write them down so we can keep track. So we know that this right here is this surface. So if we measure up from that surface, we need good spline engagement. And I would love to have all of this in there just for sake of doing it, which means we would have to go to use the whole thing. 4 1/4, 4 3/8 would be ideal for that. 4 1/4 right up to here. Well, I mean, that's doable. So in that case, we would basically have this piece welded in place. If we take this right here, we mark out our line, and we're sitting at 4 1/4 right there. So if we took this shaft, we set this in place with our marker there, and we also mark and then cut this at 4 1/4 there. What we'd be left with is this shaft just like that. Which is actually fine, that's cool. Sick, that's really not bad. And we can leave it longer because we have plenty of room, and we can actually leave this long, we can slide it up a little bit, because it's gonna end up being a butt weld, of course, because these diameters look really close. But that's not bad, that'll work pretty good. Sweet, okay, I think we're onto something. I'm gonna go ahead and double check this, and then I'll start cutting. The shaft has now been cut down, and then I prepped it with the belt sander, so we're ready to weld. Put a nice bevel on it as well. You wanna make sure you get really good penetration when you weld these things, for extremely obvious reasons. Now, this is the mark where we held this, so this is gonna get welded right there, which obviously means that these splines have to go. Now, the cool part about this is that we have so much engagement here that if we lose a little bit in either direction, which I guess really it'd just be this way, that's not a problem, it doesn't matter. You know, we have more than enough. So I'm not trying to throw any of that away, but if for any reason we go too far or whatever and we have to overhang to make up for it, we can. So now I'm gonna mark this right here because we have to cut this shaft down. So I'm gonna put this right there, give myself a little bit of space. We're just gonna Sharpie line all the way around, and we're gonna cut on this side of the Sharpie so that we overhang slightly, and that way we know we're not going to basically be too long and run into this piece, much like that. Our input shaft is now cut down, and then I took a Scotch-Brite, like a drum, and just buzzed the top of this because you wanna deburr it, but if you deburr it too aggressively with something like a flap disc, like this, you can actually roll the lip over, and then your adapter piece or your spline piece won't fit anymore. So you can see this piece fits perfect. Goes on nice and smooth. And the final product, we can finally check it out, is gonna look something like this. So that entire shaft right there is gonna live inside this housing, and it should be pretty freaking cool. Awesome, I'm stoked. And what I was gonna say is that if it has to move down or up a little bit, we have the room for that. And if we had to go real far, we can just cut more off of this spline shaft. fully loosely assembled. All the components fit. And what I basically was checking for is just making sure that this shaft could bottom out and it wasn't hitting the spline shaft on the inside. So everything is in place. And actually, this is gonna sit all the way this way, which means we have even more space than I thought we did, which is perfect. So I'm gonna go ahead and weld this stuff now. BRB. I got all the components finished welded last night. Everything came out really nice. This piece right here, I welded it pretty hot, wanted to get good penetration as it's obviously extremely important. And I wrapped it in a water-soaked rag to keep the plastic pieces from getting too hot. And after each pass, I just walk over to the sink and dip only the plastic portion and the metal around it just to keep it from slowly melting as the heat transitions through the part. And then our tube came out good as well. And we're essentially done with welding with the exception of this final bracket. So if you remember, when we first cut this out so we could gain access, we had to remove the factory weld that was here. So now I'm gonna build some version of the same bracket just to add some strength down here further so that the entire weight of this assembly is not relying on one single OEM weld. Once we're done with that, we can grease it all up, get it all assembled, and we'll move on to coming up with some sort of rear bracket that goes from here to those two rear studs. To complete this mounting bracket, I'm gonna take some scrap steel that I got, and I'm basically just gonna radius it so it wraps around the tube and fits in those spots, and then we'll just weld across there. So how I'm gonna do it is I'm gonna draw somewhat of the radius right here. It doesn't have to be great, it just has to be ballparked. I'm gonna cut that out, and then we're gonna work our way up this direction. Definitely not fit the first try, but it's gonna be close. There we go, good enough. Now I'll lean it back and we'll draw out the outline of the backside. The bracket's coming along nicely. Here's my cardboard version. Oh, I don't even know what the orientation was. All right, there it is. So, you know, something like that. And then translated to our piece of steel, it looks, I still don't know the orientation. There it is. So it's like that, but we're obviously gonna bend it, and that's what that dotted line is for. So it should fit pretty nice right there, and then wrap around our tube nice down here. So let's go get this thing in the vise. We're gonna heat it up, smack it with a hammer. And it should form okay. It's relatively thick. It's probably 1/8 inch, but you know, we'll just hit it real hard. Bent up bracket is finally complete. It looks, you know, it looks okay. This thing is not in need of aesthetics or a quality aesthetic look. As you can see by the rest of it, it's not a real 10 out of 10. So we're good, we're bent. We've got a couple little gaps, that's okay. I'm gonna TIG weld it anyway, it'll be fine. The gaps aren't too bad. We'll get this welded up and then we'll move on to our assembly. Finished bracket is finally welded. It did not weld the best, and you might have seen that. I don't know if I'll put the clips in, but there you can see here, total trash, absolute garbage, then not too bad. Trash again, and then down here pretty good, but then over here trash. Let's grab some grease and get this thing fully assembled. I couldn't stop mid-take because I had grease all over my hands, but I wanted to wipe it off to laugh in the irony that as I was trying to grease this, I don't know if you noticed, but the whole thing comes apart. So rather than welding this thing with a rag wrapped around it and talking about how I didn't know if this could be replaced because it would melt, I could have just taken the whole damn thing apart and pulled this guy out. How did I do it? Like this. And I could have just welded this thing with no issues regarding heat. But hindsight's 20/20. Oh well, if anyone's doing this at home, at least you can follow that. You can see I have all new grease in here. As I started greasing it, that's when I realized it came apart. So obviously I had to clean some of that new grease up with some of the old grease, and then we put fresh grease everywhere. So it's nice and lubricated now. I might do one more pass around the outside once we get it inside our housing here. I'm gonna go back to the time lapse as far as assembly goes. But yeah, just grease anything that looks like it needs to be greased. And remember, you can take this thing all the way apart. Cool. All right, we're fully assembled. I went ahead and stuck the wheel on the studs just to make sure that we all are working and everything is smooth. We got our wheel on our studs, and as you can see, when I turn it here, it turns right here. What more could you ask for? It looks OEM. Our tilt still works. Let's see what we got here. Full working tilt. Couldn't be happier. Everything is golden. It feels good. I'm happy. Let's get the wheel off and go get the column assembly installed. Boom, we are installed. Everything is tight. We are blinding ourselves with this light. Everything is good, everything is tight, everything fits, nothing moved. I'm really stoked on it. All of our connectors reach and plug in, and our lower connection is installed that goes to the rack. So that part is done. Now the next thing to do was the rear mount, the 2 studs hanging down, but I had to order some angle iron and that won't be here for 2 days. So while I wait for that, I went ahead and jumped to the wiring. So this is an 8-gauge wire and it runs directly from a 70 amp breaker that is fed from the battery. So no matter where you want to put that stuff, just make sure you have a breaker or an inline fuse, and then your larger gauge or 8-gauge wire runs to the top pin in this motor right here. And then I got some ground wire pre-cut as well. We're going to use the connector from Epowersteering.com with the 2 terminals. These are open barrel style, so you can use a Molex type crimper to crimp them. We're going to get the power and ground situated, and then we're going to move on to the controller. Things are moving right along with the wiring. Got my power and ground done. Power was already routed, goes into the top terminal. Ground comes out from the bottom terminal and goes to our chassis right here, sharing the same bolt hole as this cover plate right here. The next thing in line is the controller. Depending on which one you get, you may have to wire it differently. This is the first one I've wired like this, where there is a yellow wire that needs to go to an actual pin at the ECU itself. It's the second one from the bottom, and that wire is for the motor to send a torque signal to the little control module so that it can add the proper amount of assist. Now some of these things have a dial that you can turn up or down for assist. This one is automatic. They advertise it as like a newer kit. We'll see how it works. I just didn't want to have a knob, but I might regret that, so we'll see. I'll give some feedback on that once it's done. And then we have 3 other wires that also need to be routed. I put a 3-pin connector on them to make it easier just to run everything, but you don't have to. You could hardwire it. One's power, one is ground, and the other one is going to be installed based on how much assist you want. So power is going to be switch power, of course. You don't want it to have power all the time. Ground is going to go to chassis. And the gray one, you can either leave it disconnected for regular amounts of assist, you can ground it for less assist, or you can add a 100 ohm resistor and then ground it for more assist. So again, that's going to be something I have to feel out. It's going to be largely based on tire size and steering wheel size and just, you know, what you prefer. Moving right along with the wiring harness, I got the sub harness side done. We have our power lead going to a fuse tap, which is going to tap into fuse number 11 on the fuse box. There it is. Get it pulled up here pretty quick. 1, 2, 3, 4 down on the driver's side footwell is going to be the cigarette lighter fuse. So we're going to use that one to do a switch power supply with a little tiny inline fuse. It only has a 5 amp fuse inside it. We don't need anything crazy. And then our ground ring terminal is already on there, and that's going to share the same grounding point as the motor itself. The gray wire, as stated before, is going to stay disconnected. I'm going to get this installed, and we should be able to power this thing up, I think, with only 1 wire remaining, which is the gray wire right here. We're going to solder this into pin number 2 on the ECU. We should be good to go for our first test. All right, everything is wired up, and we're ready for our first test. And I don't have the steering wheel on, but I'm going to grab it and stick it on just to kind of move things around. To show you my breaker setup, again, yours will probably not be here, but it could be here. So this is it right here. Basically, my power supply comes in and distributes to the fuse box and all the wire tuck stuff. This used to be in the engine bay. And then here's the breaker for the power steering itself. So put that on. Now we got power going to our motor. Let's go turn the key on and see how well this thing works. Steering wheel is installed. I got a nut hand tied on here just so the wheel can't come off of my hands when I do my test drive around the yard. But first, let me show you what it's like steering it with no power steering. Now this is a big wheel, so you get a little bit of leverage on it. But, you know, takes a little bit of effort. Now let's try a key on and see how it feels. Now we should be able to turn this thing with 1 finger. Damn. Look at that. Very satisfying. Quick little test around the backyard. Oh man, it's so nice to be able to move the wheel with 1 hand like that. Effortless. So sick. Most of you that are going straight from hydraulic steering will not notice the joy. But man, that feels really, really nice. Oh, it's so good. And I haven't even had to dial the motor in at all. Sometimes you got to adjust a potentiometer on them, but this one seemingly has no issues. Oh my gosh, it's so nice. Just driving around like a normal car now. Not sitting here like right now, I'd be gearing up to crank this turn. Effortless, no issues. We're gonna go ahead and do a 3-point turn down here in this driveway. Just because we can, you know, flexing a little bit. Oh man, I am so stoked. All right, back into the shop, and it's time to finish up that rear bracket, and then we'll get our spline straight, get our wheel on. And a few minutes back onto the dash in the most uncomfortable position you could possibly be in. And I've whipped out this little bracket right here. Now, it's nothing special to look at, but I think it's gonna work great. I slotted both sides so it's easier to install, and also so I didn't have to be as precise with my holes. It's obviously very hard to measure when you're on your back upside down in here, so this is what had to be done. And maybe it doesn't make the most sense right now, but I'll put the camera into there and I'll try to point where it's gonna go, and then I'll put it in place, and then it should make a bit more sense. All right, so as far as where it's gonna go, do you see, I can't even get my hand in here, it's so tight, but try to. That nut in place right there, that's the factory nut. We're gonna go from that spot right to this little loop-de-loop on the motor here. I'm sorry it's out of focus, but that's the best I can do. So let me get that installed and be right back. Now you can kind of see what I was talking about. So it slides over the one stud, you tighten that nut first, and then this bolt came through and is nutted right there. And it's a little bit sideways looking because just the way the casting is on that aluminum, but it works, it's solid, and I can't shake the column at all. So I'm very happy with it. Make sure you build something like this. Again, can't stress it enough. Do not just trust two studs. I'm not gonna worry about the last stud over here because I think we're good where it is. But if I need to add one, I will. Just use your own discretion as far as how it feels when you drive. If this thing does come apart when you're driving for any reason, you can't steer anymore. So, although extremely unlikely, probably never gonna happen, just keep that in mind. Well, I got a lot more stuff to do, but I think we pretty much have covered all of the EPS stuff. Now, if you have an issue calibrating your motor, or if it turns hard right or turns hard left, or anything like that, there's plenty of videos out there. If you search Saturn View or Chevy Equinox electric steering motor calibration, you can find them. That will help you. I don't want to bore you guys with all the other stuff that I got to do in this thing, but I think we've accomplished our goal for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you follow my footsteps and do the same thing, I hope this video helps you and kind of covers all the questions you might have. And if not, I hope it was entertaining. Thank you as always. Peace out.